From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
You know, we're here today because we really believe in the message that the people at Occupy Wall Street are putting out, that the 1% of us, the wealthy of us, are benefiting at our expense, right? And that can't go on any longer.
Occupy Wall Street enters its fourth week in New York City and continues to expand across the country, from Philadelphia to Atlanta, from Des Moines to Oakland. Then who are the soldiers who died in Afghanistan? On this 10th and first 10-year anniversary of the war in Afghanistan, we look at a new report on American military deaths in the communities the soldiers come from. Then Nobel Peace Prize laureate, Yemeni activist Tawakkol Karman.
The United States, instead of supporting the opposition,
تحولت من زعيم العالم الحر إلى حارس الأنظمة المستبدة.
Now the United States transitioned from being the leader of the free world to a watchdog for tyrant regimes.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. New York City's ongoing demonstration against Wall Street continued over the weekend by taking its message to a new location in Lower Manhattan and incorporating a 24-hour art exhibit on Wall Street itself. On Saturday afternoon, thousands of supporters gathered in Washington Square Park, north of the protesters' encampment in the financial district, for a General Assembly. The NYPD responded by dispatching large numbers of police and vehicles in an apparent attempt to prevent the protesters from establishing a second base of operations. Meanwhile, that evening, protesters gathered in the historic Morgan Building on Wall Street, the former headquarters of J.P. Morgan, for an art show comprised of work created by the protesters themselves, including protest signs that have been used in marches throughout the city in recent weeks. Meanwhile, Occupy protests continue to spread to scores of cities around the country. In Washington, D.C., Ralph Nader commented on the growth of the Occupy Wall Street movement while addressing a crowd in Washington, D.C.
There's an Occupy movement in every city, town, village, farmland in America, all linked, and all pursuing fair play, pursuing justice, pursuing decentralized power, pursuing what the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag ends with, which ought to get great emphasis, right? With liberty and justice for all.
The National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. was closed Saturday afternoon after security guards used pepper spray to repel over 100 demonstrators who were told they could not enter the building while carrying signs. The protesters from the Stop the Machine occupation targeted the museum because of an exhibit on drones. Immediately after the confrontation, the American Spectator, a conservative publication, posted an article by assistant editor Patrick Howley in which he revealed he'd consciously infiltrated the group of protesters in order to discredit their movement. Howley wrote the protesters lacked the nerve to confront authority and admitted to running through the lobby of the museum, provoking guards to use their pepper spray. In the piece, Howley calls the museum the scene of his crime and admits he was the only person to make it fully inside, despite orders from security guards. Meanwhile, authorities in Des Moines, Iowa, arrested 32 people who joined approximately 150 to 200 others occupying a local park in solidarity with the Occupy Wall Street movement. In Seattle, at least 3 people were arrested in connection with an occupation protest that's drawn hundreds to the city's downtown area. 14 protesters were arrested at a park in Sacramento, California, Sunday morning, days after police took more than 20 activists into custody. In an interview on ABC this week, House Democratic leader Nancy Pelosi expressed support for the Occupy Wall Street movement's message.
Well, I support the message to the establishment, whether it's Wall Street or the political establishment and the rest, that change has to happen. We cannot continue in a way that is not relevant to their lives. People are angry.
In protest news from Britain, more than 2,000 people staged a sit-down protest on the Westminster Bridge Sunday to protest planned cuts and privatization at the National Health Service. The protest was organized by health workers and the group UK Uncut. Protesters held a general assembly in the middle of the bridge, similar to those organized by protesters on Wall Street. The Wall Street Journal is reporting the U.S. government's obtained a controversial type of secret court order to force Google and the internet provider Sonic.net Inc. to turn over information from the email accounts of WikiLeaks volunteer Jacob Appelbaum. The government's request includes the email addresses of every person Appelbaum had corresponded with for the past 2 years. The government obtained the secret order even though the 28-year-old Appelbaum has not been charged with a crime. Both Google and Sonic reportedly pressed unsuccessfully to be allowed to inform Appelbaum of the secret court orders. The Justice Department is also trying to force Twitter to hand over information about Appelbaum's account, as well as the accounts of 2 other WikiLeaks volunteers. The Obama administration's refusing to make public a secret Justice Department legal memo that authorized the assassination of the U.S.-born cleric Anwar al-Awlaki in Yemen. Al-Awlaki was killed last month in a CIA drone strike in Yemen, along with another U.S. citizen, Samir Khan. Neither man had even been convicted of a crime. According to the New York Times, the memo found it would be lawful only if it were not feasible to take al-Awlaki alive because he was taking part in the war between the United States and al-Qaeda and posed a significant threat to Americans. The secret document provided the justification for killing al-Awlaki despite an executive order banning assassinations, a federal law against murder, protections in the Bill of Rights, and various strictures of the international laws of war. The memo was principally drafted by David Barron and Martin Lederman, who were both lawyers in the Office of Legal Counsel at the time. Wired.com has revealed a computer virus has infected the cockpits of America's Predator and Reaper drones, logging pilots' every keystroke as they remotely fly missions over Afghanistan and other war zones. The military has not said whether the virus was introduced intentionally or by accident. In news from Iraq, Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki says U.S. troops can stay in Iraq as trainers beyond a 2011 withdrawal date, despite a decision by Iraq's leaders to reject immunity for any American soldiers. Iraq's leadership agreed last week U.S. troops can stay on for training, but without the legal protections demanded by Washington.
Since the need for training exists and all the political blocs acknowledge that, we have a number of choices. Now there's dialogue between us and the Americans, including a proposal for the U.S. troops to be part of NATO, as we have an agreement with NATO. The Parliament is currently discussing a law that could allow U.S. experts and trainers to stay as part of a 300-strong NATO training mission.
Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki. In other news from the Middle East, at least 31 people were killed across Syria Sunday. On Saturday, 50,000 mourners took to the streets to Kurdish-dominated Qamishli to protest the killing of opposition leader Mashal Tamo. Activists said at least 5 people were killed when security forces opened fire at his funeral. Tamo was the founder of the liberal Kurdish Future Movement Party and a former political prisoner. The nation's official unemployment rate held steady at 9.1% in September as more than 14 million Americans remain out of work. In September, 103,000 jobs were created, but economists say employers need to create about 200,000 jobs a month for a year to bring the jobless rate down by a percentage point. They need to add about 125,000 jobs a month merely to keep up with growth of the workforce population. Meanwhile, the National Women's Law Center says the recent job reports have been particularly bad for women due to the large job cuts at federal, state, and local government agencies. Of the 103,000 jobs created last month, only 4,000 went to women. Since June 2009, men have gained over 1.1 million jobs, while women have actually lost 264,000 jobs. On Saturday, President Obama used his weekly address to push for passage of his jobs bill.
Right now, hundreds of thousands of teachers and firefighters and police officers have been laid off because of state budget cuts. This jobs bill will put a lot of these men and women back to work. Right now, there are millions of laid-off construction workers who could be repairing our bridges and roads and modernizing our schools. Why wouldn't we want to put these men and women to work rebuilding America?
In other economic news, new research shows household income has declined more in the 2 years after the recession officially ended than it did during the recession itself. Between June 2009 and June 2011, inflation-adjusted median household income fell 6.7% to just under $50,000. During the recession, household income fell 3.2%. Overall, the 9.8% drop in income from the start of the recession to this June appears to be the largest in several decades. The researchers describe the decline as a significant reduction in the American standard of living. California Governor Jerry Brown signed into law the state's DREAM Act, which would allow some undocumented immigrants to receive public aid to attend college. The law is expected to benefit 2,500 students. In other news from California, federal prosecutors have announced a major crackdown on the state's medical marijuana industry. Marijuana is legal for medical use in California, but the state laws conflict with federal law, which does not recognize any legal use for marijuana. It's unclear whether similar crackdowns will follow in other states. Benjamin Wagner is U.S. Attorney in Sacramento.
We are not focused on backyard grows with small amounts of marijuana for use by seriously ill people. We are targeting commercial operations which profit from growing and distributing marijuana and which often use the trappings of state law for cover, but in fact are abusing state law.
Many medical marijuana users criticize the Obama administration's move to crack down on the industry.
I just don't understand this whole, what do you call it, business of controlling this stuff. This is the best painkiller I've ever used in my life.
The State Department is coming under increasing criticism over its review process of the proposed Keystone XL tar sands pipeline. The New York Times has revealed the State Department assigned an important environmental impact study of the pipeline to a company with financial ties to pipeline operator TransCanada. That study found the 1,700-mile pipeline would have limited adverse environmental impacts. According to the Times, the State Department allowed TransCanada to solicit and screen bids for the environmental study. TransCanada eventually recommended a Houston firm called Cardno Entrix to the study. In its marketing materials, Cardno Entrix has described itself as a, quote, major client of Keystone. In campaign news, Mitt Romney's Mormon faith became the hot topic this weekend in the Republican presidential race after a prominent backer of Texas Governor Rick Perry described Mormonism as a cult. Robert Jeffress, a Baptist minister from Dallas, made the comment to reporters at the Values Voter Summit in Washington.
Decision for conservative evangelical Christians right now is going to be, do we prefer somebody who is truly a believer in Jesus Christ or somebody who is a good moral person but is a part of a cult? And it's not politically correct to say, but it's true. Mormonism is a cult.
Meanwhile, Texas Representative Ron Paul won the straw poll at the Values Voter Summit with 37% of the vote. Herman Cain placed second. Mitt Romney, who won the 2007 straw poll, received just 4% of the vote. And in Egypt, at least 24 people died Sunday in clashes between Coptic Christians and state security forces. The violence broke out after a protest in Cairo against an attack on a church in Aswan province last week. Democracy Now! Correspondent Sharif Abdel-Quddus was in Cairo during the clashes.
Last night saw some of the worst violence and bloodshed in Egypt since the fall of Hosni Mubarak 8 months ago. A march of largely Coptic Christian protesters started off in the poor district of Shubra, marching towards the state TV building headquarters in downtown Cairo. That march, initially filled with men, women, and children, came under attack from some rock throwers. That was a brief incident, but the march continued towards the state TV building. They were protesting a recent attack on a church in southern Egypt and the recent attack on a demonstration last week by the army. At the state TV building, there was a massive security presence that had gathered there. Many armored personnel carriers were there, many hundreds of military police with batons, with shields, with helmets, lining the streets around what's called Maspero, the state TV building. There was already a group of several hundred or a few thousand demonstrators in front of Maspero awaiting the march. People were lighting candles and chanting peacefully. It was a largely peaceful scene, but this scene turned into bloodshed and chaos in a matter of seconds. Some protesters pushed back some military police, pushed them back towards where the APCs were, and then the military attacked. They came rushing forward, beating anyone in their path. Then they started opening fire. The sound of gunfire filled the air, and it was not stopping. Some people fell over as the stampede was coming back behind the Hilton Ramses, a hotel nearby. On the other side, on the main street, I was not there, but eyewitnesses have said that several armored personnel carriers began to drive into the crowd, running over people, 6 or 7 at a time. The sound of women wailing began to fill the air. I saw people being carried out in blankets covered in blood. There was fires lit. Several cars were lit on fire. The police began firing tear gas. All this was happening while on the state TV channel, the Egyptian state TV channel, was basically inciting violence, telling honest Egyptians to fill the streets and protect the army from the Coptic demonstrators who they said were attacking the army. Military police also stormed the stations of a channel called 25 and another channel, Al Hurriya, and shut it down to shut down any independent reporting. There was also groups of thugs that then filled the streets, some people chanting Islamiyya, Islamiyya, which means Islamic, Islamic, and began attacking the demonstrations. It was really a scene of chaos, a scene of bloodshed, the likes of which I have not seen since the revolution here in Cairo, and the reaction of the army does not bode well for the future. So it remains to be seen what will happen. But October 9th, I think, is a day that will go down in infamy in Egypt.
Democracy Now! Correspondent Sharif Abdel Quddus reporting from Cairo. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now! Democracy